If there is one thing that defines gaming publishers, it's greed. And few companies embody that relentless, all-consuming hunger for profit quite like Atari in the early 2000s.
Hello, I like money.
Dragon Ball Z was a goldmine, and they knew it. The Budokai series was flying off the shelves, and DBZ was at the height of its Western popularity. But for Atari, that wasn't enough. It's never enough. They wanted more. More games, more sales, more cash. Quality be damned. And so, Taiketsu was born. Not out of passion, not out of creativity, but out of corporate desperation. Webfoot Technologies, the small studio behind the Legacy of Goku series, was already hard at work on their RPG sequel when Atari shoved another project onto their plate, a fighting game. Two vastly different games, both expected to be delivered within months of each other. A team that was already stretched thin now had to scramble to make it work. And the result? Taiketsu. A game so rushed, so fundamentally flawed, that even its own developers want to forget that it ever happened.
It never happened.
But Taiketsu is more than just a bad Dragon Ball game. It's a product of unchecked greed of a company that saw a money-printing franchise and demanded more, without a second thought for those actually making the games and for the fans that were expected to play them. It's a case study in what happens when the pursuit of profit comes before the pursuit of quality. And if you've never had the misfortune of playing it for yourself, well,
if you want to know one thing, this right here is cancer.
Just one look at a screenshot of Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu and you already know something is very, very wrong.
Hello. Yuck, what the fuck?
But even the most cursed image imaginable can't fully prepare you for how bad the game actually feels to play. And in a fighting game where tight controls and responsive mechanics are everything, that's an instant death sentence. Released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance, Taiketsu was developed by Webfoot Technologies. As I just said before, they are also the creators of the Legacy of Goku, and if you have already seen my retrospective on that game, you'll know that it's fucking crap! But credit where it's due, Webfoot managed to turn things around with the Legacy of Goku 2, a legitimately great Game Boy Advance title. Probably one of the best Dragon Ball games in my opinion. So they can make good games, if they're given the chance. And in Taiketsu's case, they definitely were not. This is one of the instances where the development behind the game is a lot more interesting than the game itself. After you realize the development hell that Taiketsu went through, you almost want to excuse it from how bad it is. Almost.
Cancer.
Before we get into the catastrophe that is Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu, we need to talk about Dragon Ball Z Saiyan Smash. These two games share an unfortunate connection, one of wasted potential and abysmal execution. But if we're talking about which one suffered the worst fate, well, Saiyan Smash didn't even get the chance to be terrible. It never saw the light of day. Just weeks before Dragon Ball Z Budokai 2 dropped in late 2003, Atari announced Saiyan Smash is a brand new Dragon Ball Z title in development, slated for a mid-2004 release. It was rumoured to be an action RPG covering key events from the anime, set to launch on the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. But after the initial announcement, silence. Atari never followed up, never showed any gameplay, never released any trailers, just a whole lot of nothing. No official cancellation was ever issued, but it became painfully obvious that Saiyan Smash had been quietly scrapped. So what happened? Well, no one really knows for sure, but the most common theory is that Saiyan Smash was reworked into Dragon Ball Z Sagas, which eventually released in 2005 on the same platforms, plus the original Xbox. And if you've ever played Sagas, you'll know that that's not exactly a happy ending. The poor Xbox, the only one it got. Atari's track record with Dragon Ball Z games was spotty at best, but Sagas was a special kind of disaster. a janky, repetitive, and barely functional mess that makes even the worst Budokai knockoffs look like masterpieces. If Saiyan Smash was anything like Saga's, its cancellation may have been a mercy killing. So where does Taiketsu fit into all this? Well, Webfoot was also involved in Saiyan Smash's development, or at least in creating assets for it. Since they had already worked up a bunch of 3D models for the project, Atari, ever the pinnacle of cost-cutting efficiency, decided to recycle those assets. But instead of a full-fledged console game, they were repurposed into Taiketsu, a 2D fighter for the Game Boy Advance. And that's how we ended up one of the most ugliest and ill-conceived Dragon Ball Z games of all time. Webfoot Technologies was never exactly on the cutting edge of game development. They weren't some industry titan pushing the limits of hardware. They were a modest team, mostly known for making low-budget games throughout the 90s. And for many of the developers on Taiketsu, this was their very first time working on a fighting game. And it shows. Like most licensed games in the early 2000s, Taiketsu was a rush job from start to finish, but Webfoot wasn't just dealing with the usual crunch. They had Atari as their publisher, and Atari, they saw DBZ games flying off the shelves and wanted more fast. They didn't care about quality, just that the next Dragon Ball title hit the market as soon as possible. The problem? Webfoot already had Legacy of Goku 2 in production. That meant they weren't just making one game, they had to deliver both an RPG and a fighting game within months of each other. Since Webfoot was still a relatively small studio, they had to hire additional staff to get Legacy of Goku 2 finished. But with Taiketsu suddenly added to their workload, the team was stretched even thinner. At first, Taiketsu was being developed by a separate team, while Webfoot focused on Legacy of Goku 2. But once that game wrapped up, Webfoot had to step in and finish Taiketsu themselves. On top of also working on Saiyan Smash, that meant a small, overworked team, many of whom had never made a fighting game before, had to scramble to complete a handheld DBZ fighter under insane time constraints.
Calm down!
Honestly, I feel kinda bad for Webfoot. They never stood a chance. Atari set them up to fail, and it's no wonder the team pretends Taiketsu never existed. A lot of what Webfoot had planned for both these ill-fated titles was never even given the slightest chance to materialise. The developers may have had ambitions, but those ambitions were crushed under the weight of impossible deadlines and corporate indifference. In an interview with Chris London, the game's producer at Atari, he mentioned that Taiketsu was actually supposed to have some kind of connectivity with future GameCube titles. What title exactly? He never specified, but if I had to guess, it was most likely meant to link up with Saiyan Smash, a game that, much like Taiketsu's potential, never saw the light of day. And that sentiment radiates throughout the entirety of Taiketsu. The whole game feels unfinished, like a product that was meant to be more but never got the time, resources, or attention it needed. It's as if you're playing something that wasn't so much developed as it was extracted from the team at the last possible second. There's an overwhelming sense that things are just missing. Features that were planned but scrapped, mechanics that feel half-baked, and ideas that were thrown onto the cutting room floor before they could even be fully realised. It's not just that Taiketsu is a bad game, it's a very hollow game. A game that never got to be what its developers might have hoped for, instead left to exist as a cautionary tale of what happens when a publisher prioritizes greed.
Why make trillions when we could make billions?
A trillion is more than a billion, numbnuts.
All right, zip it.
If there's one thing I can give to Taiketsu, and trust me, I really don't want to, it's that there is actually a decent number of modes that you can play. Webfoot at least tried to pad out the game's longevity with a handful of different ways to suffer through it. The main offering is your standard tournament mode, where you progress through a gauntlet of opponents before facing off against a final boss character. Beating the boss unlocks them for play, which is at least something to work towards, though the reward hardly feels worth the effort. There's also a small, borderline irrelevant bit of story attached to each character, but all you get is a lifeless text scroll at the end. So yeah, technically this could be considered the game's story mode, but that is being very generous. Beyond that, there are a few other modes: time challenges, endurance battles, and a training mode. Taiketsu even has a Z store where you can spend points to unlock extra modes and match modifiers like invisible fighters, unlimited supers and one-hit knockouts. Credit where it's due, that's actually some decent features. And it even had 2-player link cable support, which, while completely useless now, was probably a decent inclusion at the time. On paper, there's stuff to do. The problem? You actually have to play the game to do it. And that's where the real pain begins. Let's address the massive elephant in the room. This game looks uniquely awful. It is, without exaggeration, one of the ugliest Dragon Ball games ever made. Maybe even just games in general. The proportions are completely wrong. Every character has short, stumpy arms, bloated heads, and awkward, stiff poses. You can tell who everyone is, but this is probably the least appealing any of them have ever looked. Even those cursed Funko Pops managed to have more charm than these sprites. And the worst part, this wasn't even intentional. This was a shortcut. The sprites were created using pre-existing 3D models, likely from Saiyan Smash, which were then rendered in the Donkey Kong Country style. In theory, this technique can work, but here, it's a total disaster. The devs clearly had zero time to clean up the renders, so the characters just look off. And the way they move, somehow even worse. The animations are stiff, janky and lifeless, making every action feel sluggish and awkward. The controls are unresponsive, adding another layer of frustration to an already painful experience. Taiketsu boasts a roster of 15 characters, though you'll have to slog through the tournament mode to unlock them all. And to be fair, the selection is actually pretty solid. There's a nice mix of heroes and villains, covering all the major players from the Z era. But here's the real kicker. Every single fighter plays pretty much exactly the same. There are no unique kicks, no distinct special moves, just the same stubby punches, the same laughably awkward leg sweep things or whatever the hell that is, and the same stiff uppercut across the entire cast. The only thing that differentiates them is their supers, and even those feel terrible to use, thanks to the game's choppy animations and unresponsive controls. It's like Webfoot tried to make a fighting game, but forgot that part of what makes fighting games fun is having actual variety between characters. And don't even get me started on the sky battles. You'd think a Dragon Ball Z game would nail the aerial combat, right? Nope. Not here. It's just two characters awkwardly floating, sluggishly trading blows in a way that feels even less responsive than the already clunky ground combat. It's a gimmick that should have added depth, but instead it just makes fights even more of a chore. It just looks so stupid. But the bizarre design choices don't stop there. There are some straight up weird issues with the game's presentation. For starters, the character portraits are a mess. Cell and Broly are only playable in specific forms, yet their portraits don't even match the forms they actually fight in. It's the kind of sloppiness that makes you wonder if anyone at Webfoot actually had time to polish or even look at the final product before it was shipped. And then there's the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Characters make no noises when throwing out their signature attacks. No grunts, no energy blasts, just eerie, unnatural silence. Even when they're getting absolutely pummeled, they suffer in silence, like they've resigned themselves to their fate. And honestly, that just makes the whole experience even more depressing. Taiketsu might have a variety of modes to suffer through, but no amount of unlockable characters or gimmicky match modifiers can fix the fact that its core gameplay is a clunky, unresponsive disaster. What's the point of having multiple ways to play if every single one of them is miserable? At the end of the day, Taiketsu is a disaster, an awkward, clunky, barely functional attempt at a fighting game that never should have left the drawing board. And yet, it still managed to sell over 600,000 copies. Honestly, that number baffles me. I can only imagine how many kids excitedly tore off the plastic wrap, popped the cartridge into their Game Boy Advance, and were met with this. No amount of childhood optimism could mask just how broken and lifeless the game truly is. And yet, I can't bring myself to fully hate it. After learning about the mess that was its development, I almost feel bad for Webfoot Technologies. They were stretched way too thin, trying to juggle multiple projects with little time or resources. all while Atari loomed over them demanding more. It was clear that Taiketsu was never set up to succeed. But feeling bad for the devs doesn't change the reality of the poor kids who got stuck with this game. They deserve better. Dragon Ball Z deserved better. And frankly, even Webfoot Technologies deserve better. But not Atari, fuck them, they can piss off.